Hey everybody, this is Jessica Lynn of Jessica Lynn Original Studios, and I'd like to welcome you to a very special storytelling of the Wilderness Lodge. Now, recently there has been a lot of let's take away stories, even though Disney really is all about storytelling and folklore. And I think if someone actually tells the story, maybe all of a sudden you'll look at it a little differently. And then you'll start to say, hey Disney, we want more backstories. We want that same immersive storytelling back in our hotels. Now, in the commemorative edition of the Silver Creek Star newspaper, it was volume B, number 28928, which was actually just a newsletter that they put into the guests folder, and it was a really great way to share procedures and updates about the lodge. But this one issue had a very rich history, and it was all about one man, Colonel Ezekiel Moreland. So I'm going to go ahead and read it as it was, and I hope this gives you a little bit more perspective on why the Wilderness Lodge is the way it is. A magnificently beautiful valley in America's Northwest was discovered by Colonel Ezekiel Moreland in the 1800s. He described the location in a letter to his daughter Genevieve as a tranquil valley along the shores of a splendid lake, a cathedral of trees that touch the sky, a stream that glitters the radiant light, the rocks and minerals of every color. I call this sweet valley Silver Creek Springs. Later he returned to settle this frontier area and make it a new home along with his daughter Genevieve. Jenny, as well as a traveling companion that she brought along who was a young Austrian artist, Frederick Alfonso Gustav, who had a desire to capture in paintings this new frontier he had been hearing so much about from different written and oral accounts. Moreland was a veteran of World War of 1812, recently widowed and inspired by the accounts of Lewis and Clark. The retired colonel mounted a westbound expedition in 1823, starting from the Missouri River. His party of 50 or more ran into quite a bit of disaster. They encountered a stampede of over 10,000 buffalo that nearly destroyed everything they had brought along in just their 80 miles of travel. The men limped back to St. Louis, and all but Moreland gave up on the expedition. He wrote a letter to his Genevieve. I take the wilderness alone. The good earth will provide me everything I need to survive. I have my gun, I have my courage, I have my determination. What need have I of anything else, especially of cowardly scoundrels who turn in the smallest face of adversity? During his explorations, he stumbled across the wilderness paradise that captured his imagination and his heart. Thanks to a collection of beaver pelts and other valuable furs he obtained on his travel, he emerged from the frontier 2 years later a very wealthy man. Genevieve and Gustav joined Moreland in St. Louis to make a return trip to Silver Creek Springs, with the intent on making it their new home. Silver Creek was named for its mineral deposits coming from a natural hot spring that made the water just shimmer. According to the Silver Creek Star, it said, using the fortune her father had raised from the fur trade, they brought out a crew of men from St. Louis and had a small lodge built near the freshwater spring. Jenny would remain in Silver Creek Spring for the remainder of her life. She established a preservation area in her father's honor where we could enjoy the natural beauty of the wilderness. The Wilderness Lodge welcomed artists, scientists, and nature lovers of all kinds over the years. As the number of visitors grew, the lodge expanded to accommodate even more. Eventually, they added rooms that grew around the springs and actually made it part of the Wilderness Lodge. Standing upon the high rocks of the valley, Colonel Ezekiel Moreland discovered the young artist Gustav had immediately unpacked his gear and set up an easel on a rocky area that provided the best views of the area. Again, according to the article in the Silver Creek newspaper, no sooner had the brush touched the canvas than the ground began to tremble. The artist grabbed his seat and managed to keep his easel from falling. After the tremors had subsided, he looked at the colonel and Jenny and smiled. You see, Colonel, I'm something of a frontiersman myself. Only the colonel knew what lay in store. The tremor was only a warning. The explosion of the geyser was sudden and swift, and the sound of so much water being propelled at such a height Basically, it was unexpected, and the easel, the artist, and all of his supplies tumbled over the edge. Gustav did survive the fall, and despite the obvious dangers, the ledge became his favorite place to paint from. The ledge soon became a favorite of other artists as well, such as men like Albert and Thomas, who soon flocked to the area in search of the perfect landscape. Years later, when the actual lodge was finished, a formal dining room was built in the exact location, and it was named the Artist Point. The Artist Point became a location where guests could experience the grandeur of the vistas and see what the painters who went there and saw. Their work actually is decorating the entire dining room. According to the legend, Gustav produced some of the most magnificent paintings of the West and inspired an imagination of an entire nation. Just as every area on Pleasure Island was tied to a larger story of Meriwether Adam Pleasure, nearly every location in the Wilderness Lodge had a backstory as well. The boat rental, the bike building, located near the lakeshore, supposedly was the original cabin that Colonel Ezekiel Moreland built after arriving. There are even a host of characters that once were in this newsletter. Now, the thing that's great is that they're not forgotten because these now have become Disney folklore. For example, there was a character at one point named Georgie McGregor. He was an unlucky prospector who arrived in the valley in 1852 trying to seek his fortune. And according to the Silver Creek Star, it said even if old George was a few logs shy of a full load in the common sense department, he was nevertheless very cunning and approachable. When he arrived at the Wilderness Lodge, he presented himself not as a prospector, but as a cook. The frontier at this time did not have a surplus of chefs, so with skills that were very highly valued, the lodge became a wonderful place for artists and many other creative people. Now, Georgie's idea was that he was actually going to have a place kind of down by the river, and what he wanted to be able to do was to be able to be closer to the trout. And so if you go into Roaring Forks, and this was something I found recently, there is a whole slew of fly fishing, like hand-tied flies and some old rods, and those belong to Georgie McGregor. So those were his. He used those to go fishing. And it says, if you keep me down by the stream, I won't bother any of your guests, and I'll be closer to the trout. And then I can clean the pans easier that way too. Now, Genevieve actually discovered that McGregor's deception. When a surprise visit to his camp, she discovered cooking pans were filled with water, and they were trying to pan for gold. But he was a good enough gun shooter that he was able to shoot a trout point blank with his pistol to make a meal. Jenny decided that they were going to hire him as a cook, and they found a new army sergeant. But he didn't stop McGregor, who was doing weird odd chores and still part of the process. On a supply run to the trading post for cooking utensils and fishing gear, Georgie returned with two grates. One he took to the kitchen and the other he hauled off to his cabin. Georgie was cooking up one last plan to try and figure out fame and fortune. The next morning, he served breakfast and quickly slipped away to his cabin. The guests were still gathered on the table discussing how much better the food tasted when all of a sudden there was an explosion that shook the foundation of the lodge. So after collecting themselves, they ran down the stream in a panic. Where the stream had once flowed really nicely over rocks, now was a large, cavernous, smoldering hole deep in the earth. Georgie was nowhere in sight, and his cabin was splintered and roofless. The group stood there in amazement at the damage all around them. They could hear a voice in the distance, and they realized that George had blown himself up into a pine tree. A box of labeled dynamite stood under that tree. It was the last time that George ever tried to look for gold and silver, and that huge cratered area became a pool. They went ahead and filled it with water, and obviously the river flowed right into it, and they were able to use that as a wonderful recreational pastime for all of the guests at the lodge. And that's just one example of such an immersive backstory. So when I say I want the stories for each hotel. I want to hear that about the Riviera and any other new hotel that they build. I think that it is such a homage to the whole, creative and artistic ability of what the Disney company has to offer. Now, the Wilderness Lodge doesn't offer a copy of the Silver Creek Star anymore, which is a bummer. And the only way you can find a copy of this historical document, if you will, is you may be able to find one on eBay, or somebody has one still in a folder from when they went back in the 90s. But if you go on the tour, sometimes the rangers will talk about these different things, about the wonders of the lodge. It's a walking tour that you can take. It's usually in the morning, like 9 or 10 in the morning. But here's the thing. These vivid adventures of Colonel Moreland, Meriwether Adam Pleasure, like Pleasure Island, they may have completely disappeared from Disney history within less than 2 decades. But think about how many amazing tales should be recorded and shared. It gives you such a different feel about the Wilderness Lodge. So I hope that you enjoyed this. I appreciate you being here. Again, it is the reason that the Wilderness Lodge is really one of my favorite hotels on property. If you have any questions about it, or if you're able to find a copy of this, you'll be able to see loosely the same story that I just read. But I do want to say, I hope that you enjoyed this. Be sure to go ahead and subscribe to my channel. I've got a ton of new content coming. I appreciate each and every one of you. Take care, and I'll see you again soon. Bye, everybody.